apart. right, good morning, everyone. It's good to be able to have an opportunity with you all virtually today to work with you as we discuss once again our comprehensive plan. So once again, welcome, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. Thank you very much for joining us. But perhaps more importantly, thank you for your commitment to the Charlotte Future comprehensive plan. I appreciate your continued participation. We've received a lot of comments since this was actually released in October of last year, and thanks to you for that. So I want to introduce our staff team. I don't know, I can't see the screen, so I don't know which ones are on with us today, but okay, you can see Alicia Osborne, project manager, is on. Thank you. And I see Kathy Cornett, our deputy project manager, and I see Marty. So thanks to all our staff members for really being here and working on this continuously, especially over the last 2 years. We started this process again in 2018, and we've been able to advance a lot of things, perhaps more importantly, engagement of the community, which is really more important to this process. So we are in the fourth phase of the plan, which really includes the review of the plan and ultimately adoption by council in April. So while today is an opportunity to have conversations with our guest speaker and to get some answers to questions that you may have, it is by no means the last time you are going to have an opportunity to provide an input into the process. We still want to hear from you. There will be a public hearing by council in March, I believe, and March 22nd, and then in April 26th, we will be presenting this to council for adoption. We started this series in January, and we wanted to bring in different speakers from communities that have gone through the same process that we are currently going through, who probably have some similarities with us in terms of the issues that we're dealing with, whether they be affordable housing or they be mobility, whatever the issues and the challenges may be. We wanted to make sure that we bring in participants that are gone through the process and can really share with us some of their thoughts. Last month, January, we had Kimberly Griggins from the DC Housing Conservancy to share our experience with us with regards to Washington, DC, with regards to housing issues and all of that. And we appreciate the opportunity for some of you to participate at that time and you had questions. You're hearing from innovative and leading practitioners around our country. And today is going to be Paul Mogush. Paul has become a friend since the first time we met, I believe, just before COVID-19 hit, and at the very beginning of our comprehensive plan. He came down from Minneapolis to actually, participate in the process of engaging the community. And then we've also, I think last year, we teamed up together to present to the American Planning Association on the issue of single-family zoning. But the plan is not just about single-family zoning, as you will be hearing today. It's just a lot about many things: equity, climate, mobility, and making sure that we're providing affordable housing even for our residents, in our city as our city grows. So Paul is the manager, if I will introduce him quickly before he comes up. Paul is the manager of community planning at the city of Minneapolis, where he has worked as a city planner for over 15 years. The community planning team actually led the development of Minneapolis's comprehensive plan. We call it Minneapolis 2040, which was a progressive comprehensive plan that focuses on racial equity, housing affordability, and climate change. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Alicia so that she can really walk us through the rest of this, and then I'll be back on to moderate the session between us and Paul. So Alicia.
Thanks, Ty, and thank you all for participating today. What we'll do now, if you have any questions or anything you would like answered, please use the question and answer feature. And also just feel free to answer any questions. We'll be answering them during Paul's presentation and afterwards as well. Any questions that aren't answered will be, we will reply to those later, and you'll receive a copy of the chat and a summary of today's proceedings. So what we'll do now is just turn it over to Paul and let him share his information and what he needs to share with us today to help us better understand what's in our Charlotte Future 2040 plan, and then his experiences in Minneapolis. Thank you, Paul. And Taiwo.
Thank you, Alicia. Good morning. Thanks, Taiwo. It's nice to see you all this morning. And thanks for inviting me to be a part of the conversation on the future of Charlotte. It's an honor to be with you. I'm going to do my best to share my screen here and get started with a few comments. Now, my goal is to speak for maybe 10 minutes. We'll see if I can hold myself to that, to provide just some context for what we've been up to in Minneapolis, and then try to leave as much time as we can for a conversation after that. So somebody on the staff team, please let me know if you can't see the slideshow here. Okay.
Yes.
Thanks, Ty. So just a little context about Minneapolis itself first. It's a little bit situated a little bit differently from Charlotte in some, I think, important ways. So we are a city of 425,000 people in a larger region of 3.4 million people. So relative to the region, we have a smaller portion of folks living within the central city of Minneapolis relative to the region than Charlotte does. Part of that is because we have another city next to us, St. Paul, but we also just have a pretty large portion of our regional population living in the suburbs immediately outside of Minneapolis and St. Paul. So we are just 54 square miles in a much larger region of about 1,000 square miles. And another thing that's interesting about the way planning works here in the Twin Cities area is that we have a regional government that covers both central cities and all of the suburbs. There are something like 180 suburbs of the two cities in 7 counties. And that government is called the Metropolitan Council. And they are responsible for overseeing planning, land use planning, and transportation planning that happens in all of those cities and suburbs under their jurisdiction. All of this is governed by state law. So we are actually, as a city, required under the law to do a comprehensive plan and to update it every 10 years and to make it consistent with the larger regional vision, as well as compatible with what all of our neighbors are doing. So it's a big process that's governed by the law, and we have to do it. So we do have to do it, but we also think it's a good idea. In fact, we think that planning is actually critical to the future of our city. So we are just on the heels of a comprehensive planning process. We actually were releasing our plan for public comment about where you are now in Charlotte around the time that Charlotte started its comprehensive planning process in 2018. So we're about 3 years now removed from that. And we started the process by identifying a series of values: growth in population and jobs, racial equity, sustainability, livability, economic competitiveness, good government. And we had conversations with the larger community first to affirm these values with them, and then to discuss in more detail what we were trying to achieve with this plan. And that conversation resulted in the identification of 14 specific goals, each making a statement of where we aspire to be as a city in 2040. And I know you've done something similar in Charlotte with your plan. So why am I talking about this? I think it's important in answering the question of why do we plan? Why have a comprehensive plan, especially in your case, if you're not even required to have one by law? So like a lot of you, I've been spending a lot more time at home lately with my family during this pandemic, actually pretty much all my time. Today is a rare day when I'm actually in the office downtown. So when I was thinking about this question of why do we plan, my mind immediately went to parenting. Now it's very much an imperfect analogy, but bear with me for a minute. So parents make dozens of decisions per day about our kids that affect their long-term future. So I was thinking about what informs these decisions that we make for our kids. Well, for one, our values. So some things parents might value for their family and their kids are safety, health, education, probably a whole bunch of other things. And we might even set some goals related to those values, however obvious or simple they might be. So on the safety front, my goal is no emergency room visits. I do not want to take my kids to the hospital to get a broken bone fixed or something. And then we put rules in place for our kids that will help them achieve those goals. So in a perfect world, we're not litigating these rules on a case-by-case basis. One of my kids asked me, can I play a video game? Well, I don't have to weigh that decision every time they ask against our long-term goals for our kids, because my wife and I have a rule in place on that subject. Sure, it's a yes, you can play a video game as long as you exercise for 30 minutes earlier in the day, for example. So setting clear expectations with our kids and sticking with those expectations every day means they are more likely to succeed. So the analogy, of course, is that cities make dozens of decisions per day about how we use our land. And those decisions affect our collective long-term future. Now, what informs those decisions about how we use our land? Well, a comprehensive plan can provide that, it does provide that decision-making framework. And when you're talking about goals as big and as important as racial equity, affordable housing, and a healthy planet, you want to make it as easy as possible to make decisions on a day-to-day basis that help advance those goals. Now, in our plan in Minneapolis, we have 14 goals, but these three up on the screen that I just mentioned are really the ones that rose to the top in terms of what we heard from our community when we had those conversations. And for our process, we chose to lead with racial equity because our city has some of the worst racial disparities in the country. And because frankly, this is an issue that cities and also the planning profession in general have a lot of catching up to do. So we spent a lot of time educating ourselves as staff members and the larger community and our elected officials about how we ended up with the racial disparities that we have, especially as they relate to land use, because that's the toolbox we have with a comprehensive plan. And what became clear is that in the first half of the 20th century, three policies worked together to determine where people could and couldn't live, and to specifically deny people of color the choice of where to live, and to deny them the opportunity to build wealth through home ownership. Now, redlining and racially restrictive covenants, these aren't legal today. You can't do this anymore. But their legacy remains, and it's very clear. In our city, in Minneapolis, the high amenity areas, which are in our city, it's the areas around our lakes and the biggest parks and so on. In Minneapolis, the high amenity areas that restricted people of color in the first half of the 20th century are still primarily white today. So these policies have had an enduring legacy. And even when those practices became illegal, single-family zoning remained, continuing to restrict housing choice in large areas of the city and also most other cities. So we thought it probably doesn't make sense to continue this. Eliminating single family zoning is not going to solve our racial disparities on its own, but it's one step that we could take, and so we did. We also know that housing costs are rising in cities that are doing well overall economically, and Minneapolis is one of those cities. With our racial disparities, it means that when the rent goes up, that disproportionately affects people of color in our city. So doing something about the housing affordability problem is one way of contributing to the overall goal of racial equity in our city. But let's take a step back and just ask, why are housing costs going up in the first place? It's for a lot of reasons. But the biggest one is simply that we're not building enough housing. In Minneapolis and many other metro regions across the country, including Charlotte, you can see CLT on this graph, housing production isn't keeping up with population growth. So there are more people, but not more housing. So the law of supply and demand takes over, and the rent goes up. It goes up for everybody, but as I mentioned, in our city, that disproportionately affects people of color. So our approach in our comprehensive plan, Minneapolis 2040, on this issue was to do three things to help increase housing choice and affordability for our residents. One, as I mentioned, we ended single family zoning. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Two, we reintroduced the possibility of building missing middle housing. So if you're not familiar with that term, if you think about what gets built in most cities, you'll see single family homes being built, on the edge of the city or in the suburbs, or single family homes replacing older ones in the middle of the city. You'll see large apartment buildings being built, but you tend not to see much in between. 15-unit buildings, 5-unit buildings, 25-unit buildings. You don't see a lot of that. And in our city, like in a lot of cities, it wasn't legal to build that type of housing. So it really restricted the choices that people had. So we brought that back. And the third thing that we did is we made it easier to build denser, multi-story, multi-family housing near transit, so that people will have the opportunity to live a lifestyle that relies less on driving alone in a single occupancy vehicle to help us with our climate change goals. So to add just some geography, some visuals to those three elements, in our farthest out neighborhoods in Minneapolis that were previously zoned just for single family homes, that was about half of our city. We now allow up to 3 units on every lot to be built. In our neighborhoods closest to the center of the city, to downtown, this is where we've introduced or reintroduced the possibility for people to build missing middle housing. And if you can see from this photo, these are places that already have quite a mix of housing, from single family homes up to mid-sized apartment buildings. And then to make sure that we're making it easy to build larger, denser multifamily housing developments in the center of the city and the many streets throughout the city that have access to frequent transit service, whether it's a bus or a light rail train. And what's really important is that in all of these cases, these types of development can be built as of right. That just means that if you follow all the rules that are in the zoning ordinance, you can build a building at 10 stories if that's what the plan says you can build the building at. There isn't a negotiation process that takes place. There are rules about what the design of the building can be, how big it can be, but if you follow those rules, as a developer, you're going to get a building permit to build that. So we have very specific guidance for this for every property in the city. If you're a developer or a homeowner or anybody who's interested, you can go into an interactive map, click on a property, and see exactly what's allowed to be built. And those collection of decisions that take place over years and years are what allow us to move forward in achieving the goals that we've set for our city. And we're pretty sure that this approach works because we've done it before on a smaller scale. We had places prior to this Minneapolis 2040 effort, we had places around the city with this type of specific guidance that made it easier to build what we said we want developers to build to help us achieve goals. This is an example along a popular bike trail in the south side of the city called the Midtown Greenway, where we had a plan that said you can build 6-story buildings. And so that's what we got. And so now we have thousands of new homes for people along this bike trail amenity in the south side of the city. So those are some introductory remarks. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and I'll turn it back to Ty.
Wow, thank you, Paul. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. Now, I've seen a couple of them, but before I go to those questions, let me ask you a couple of these, because obviously you've gone through a lot in going through this and reading your plans. You had over 100 meetings, 2 years of civic engagement with the community and residents. People were able to share their vision. But one thing that occurred to me in reading your plan was, it was very loud and clear, very obvious to me that people felt that as the city was growing and developing and businesses were moving into Minneapolis, and it was thriving community, a thriving city, let's put it that way. They felt that there were some people who were benefiting from the impact of the growth, and there were some who were burdened by the impact of the growth. And so it was obvious that, at least one thing that was obvious to me in going through it was people felt that everyone should benefit. So how did the land use plan become a platform for undoing barriers and helping people to overcome the inequities created by what you just shared with us, legacy of segregation, the history, some of the practices? How did you use a land use plan to answer that question of equity?
Thanks, Ty. Great question. And that was probably the #1 topic of conversation, what you just pointed out, as we were working through this process over a number of years with our community. And I want to be really honest about something. When we started this process, we as the planners who were managing this process, we didn't know the answer to Ty's question that he just asked. We didn't know, how can we use a land use plan, which as planners is our primary tool in the toolbox, to help achieve this goal of racial equity that we all know is very important, and that really, in my opinion, is an emergency that we need to address. And so we were led by happenstance to a group in our city called Mapping Prejudice. And they are a group at the University of Minnesota and another nearby university that were investigating all of the property deeds in our city for all the homes and looking for racially restrictive covenants, and then mapping those around the city so that we as a community could see where do we have that ugly history of exclusion in our city. And that was really eye-opening for us as planners and for the larger community, because we knew about this history. We knew, of course, that there were racist housing policies in our past, but to see it play out on a map of the city that we know and love was really eye-opening and helped to propel that conversation as a community and helped us arrive at what we hope are some solutions that will that will contribute to moving past that and achieving racial equity for everybody. So those solutions are, as I mentioned, one, just getting rid of our part of it as a city, which the zoning played a part. So we wanted to change the zoning to no longer just be restrictive as single family. That's part of it. But I think what's even more important is to make sure that we are, at the very least, now this is not enough, but at the very least, making sure that we are keeping up with the demand for housing overall, to try and prevent the rent and the housing prices from going up even further. That is probably the single most important part of the land use plan for us in making sure that we're moving towards racial equity. Now, it is not even close to enough. We also have to make, and we are making, very proactive investments, both on the other side of the equation, which is the jobs side, to make sure that people are financially successful, but also on the housing side to subsidize affordable housing and make sure that everybody has a place to live.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So I'm going to stay on this subject a little bit. We've got a lot of good questions coming in, but before I pivot, just a new word since this pandemic hit, is pivot, right? But before I pivot to those questions, I have a couple more for you. So we know about Minneapolis 2040 plan, but the headline is how Minneapolis eliminated single family zoning. That's not the only thing that the plan was about, right? I mean, it had 14 goals, like you said, and one of them was affordable housing and accessible housing to everyone who lives in Minneapolis by 2040. But the headline, of course, is how Minneapolis eliminated single family zoning. So talk to us about that a little bit, the impact of that on residents, on covenant restrictions, impact of that on equity, on developers, the whole gamut. If I live in an HOA environment, how should I be worried? How do you address that? And what's the expectation since the plan was adopted? I believe it was adopted 12-1, right? Or so. But what was the impact and how? Talk to us about that, just maybe in a few minutes, and then I'll go to the questions that are on the chat platform.
So one thing that we tried to communicate as clearly as we could during the process of developing this plan was that we really expected that any change that would come from these new policies would be incremental in terms of what actually happens on the ground, in terms of redevelopment that takes place. And that has really borne out to be true. The plan itself went into effect on January 1st of 2020. So we're just over a year into implementation of the plan. And on this, of course, there's a lot of interest in how many 2-unit and 3-unit buildings have been built in places where it wasn't previously allowed. And it's that the numbers are relatively small. We've seen, I believe, 34 duplexes have been built and 8 triplexes have been built in a city that has 120,000 parcels of land in it. So it has been incremental. Just like in most cities, most of our population growth and household growth is taking place in larger multifamily buildings. So, we'll have in 2020, I think our city permitted 6,000 housing units. The vast majority of those were in apartment buildings.
So it has not been overwhelming. It's really been more of increment and gradual. And then what role does the market has to play even in that, especially when you talk to developers?
Right. I mean, the market is key. That's how things happen. Of course, the city doesn't decide where market activity takes place, where development happens. The city provides the framework and the rules, and then the marketplace does its work. And that's the reason why, for our purposes in Minneapolis, we were very careful to make sure that the rules, the map for what can be built, followed a very similar pattern in all parts of the city, so that the marketplace could do its work. And what we're seeing is that in the places where the market wants to go, the kind of the hot markets, or the highest amenity parts of the city where the rent is high, that's where the activity continues to happen, because we've made room for that in the land use map. And what that means is you're going to see less spillover of that market activity into other places in the city where it might be less welcome and might have more of a displacing effect, moving people out.
So the key then is making sure that you allow the entire city to have the ability to absorb, whether it's duplexes over there or triplexes over there, or maybe fourplexes over there. Okay, that's great.
That's right.
Yeah, I know we've got about 20 questions and we've got about 40 some minutes. So let's see if we can go through most of them. So the first question from one of the attendees is that, in light of how contentious rezoning meetings can be, especially when NIMBY is not in my backyard, when they oppose the proposed changes, how has the introduction of multi-housing options into historically single-family neighborhoods been received in Minneapolis?
Thanks for that question. That's a really good question. And it gets to something that I want to make sure I communicate about our experience in Minneapolis. We thought it was very important that this plan, Minneapolis 2040, be more than just a decision-making framework that we consult in a reactive way. We want it to be proactive and make sure that we set rules, just like with my parenting analogy, that we set rules for what can and can't be built that are consistent with that larger vision for the entire city. So on the same day that the plan went into effect on January 1st of last year, we changed the zoning code for the whole city to allow up to 3 units on every property that had previously been zoned just for single family. So there weren't any negotiations to be had if somebody wanted to build a duplex or a triplex on one of those properties. It's just allowed. It's been allowed since January 1st. Similarly, for the rest of the city, in the places where I showed we're allowing missing middle housing and we're allowing larger, denser apartment buildings near transit, we did the same thing. That went into effect just at the beginning of this year. So we're just a few days into that now. Now it is the case that if you look at the map in the comprehensive plan and you see that you can build a 6-story building there, that's what the zoning allows. And there's no rezoning hearing to be had. There are important processes. That doesn't take the process out of it. There are important processes for ensuring that the building is designed in a way that's compatible with the surroundings, and that and there are still opportunities. There are public hearings for that. But in terms of whether or not the building can be built, no rezoning is necessary.
All right. Well, this is a related question. So how does the removal of single-family zoning work in existing areas where there are private deed restrictions, planned community covenants, conditions and restrictions, CCNRs, related to single-family minimum square footage, architectural review requirements? And what is the process for a homeowner and an HOA in older areas to challenge a new development within a single-family area?
So here's where the differences between our two cities come into play, and I can maybe dodge part of that question, Ty, which is, our city stopped expanding 60, 70 years ago. We are landlocked with suburbs around us, so we don't have new subdivisions. We don't have HOAs within our city boundaries for the most part. we just have a relatively uniform grid of streets and lots. We just about, if you live in or own a single family home in our city, you almost certainly live on a 5,000 square foot lot that looks just like everybody else's.
Mm-hmm.
And the rules apply to you in the same way that they apply to everybody else. So we didn't have to deal with that, quite frankly.
Okay. That's definitely something that we're going to have to do because we continue to grow as a city. So here's another related question. So while this was going on, were there, and I know after it was adopted, you then started working on the regulatory piece extensively, but was there any temporary or interim zoning policy or ordinances changes that were implemented while the plan was going on, or did you wait until the plan was done before? I know that you said the date was adopted, there was a change in code with regards to R3, but while the plan was going on, were there any interim or temporary changes to ordinances or zoning code?
No,
Okay.
we just continued to operate under the old rules and the old plan,
Okay.
which in our case weren't as old because we, as I mentioned at the beginning, we are required by law to update our comprehensive plan every 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, that wasn't, that was relatively fresh in the grand scheme of things, I guess. So we just kept on going with the old policies.
So Paul, you used the word incremental earlier, and I agree with you. It doesn't happen all at once. There is the market forces, obviously, and then there is a whole lot of other things too. But whether it's incremental or it happens rapidly, you still have to communicate the land use changes, right?
Right.
So one of the questions here is, how did you communicate the land use changes in the adopted plan to the communities? Where they had conflicting expectations. I mean, there are people, this is their largest investment, in terms of single family home, this is their path to wealth. And all of a sudden you're talking about diversifying, housing product, bringing in duplexes, triplexes, townplexes, maybe even in some cases, fourplexes. How did you communicate that? And how did you get the council to get 12-1, but also community to actually be able to buy into this?
Good question. I'll answer that in a couple of ways. One, for folks who were concerned about how is this going to affect the way my neighborhood feels and looks, and what can happen next door to me, especially in those previously single-family only areas, we made a clear commitment that when this new policy goes into place, a duplex or a triplex that's built or converted, because you can also convert to an existing home, will be subject to the same rules as a single family home regarding how big the building can be and what its setbacks are from the property line and the height of the building and so on. That's one thing that we communicated that I think helped. Another thing is that what we discovered is that through the public process that we did is that there were just a lot of individuals and organized groups out there who were really concerned about the direction our city was going. They were really concerned about the affordability problem, the lack of housing choice in our city, the worsening disparities that we were seeing. And people were looking for ways of helping with all of those things. So when it came time for the city council to make a decision about this, those groups lined up at the microphone and expressed their support for the approach that we were proposing because they wanted to see solutions to those very real problems.
But you used a lot of graphics in communicating with the community, let them know what the scale of development will be versus what's going on. Okay, so let's talk a little bit before I have a question related to ADUs, which I will ask you, but let's talk about mobility. I know that Minneapolis has one of the best light rail systems in the country, and I was part of a team that helped to study BRT system in Minneapolis some years ago. You've got a lot of good transit system. People use bicycle a lot in Minneapolis, probably number one in the country for use of bicycles. So you've got a lot of bicycle ways, you have a lot of green ways and all of that. But did this plan weave into it mobility solutions and transit? Because then if you are giving developers opportunity to take away single family homes and build, multiple units, people automatically think that you're introducing more traffic vehicles and vehicle trips into the community. So how did you weave transit and mobility discussions into the whole planning process?
Good question, Ty. So we made transportation a very central and important part of this plan, and tried to make the case that the way our city grows and changes from a land use and development standpoint is very much tied to the way our city changes and evolves from a transportation standpoint. And we did some research to figure out what is it going to take to achieve what had already been established as a goal in our city of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions 80% by the year 2050. It's a goal that a number of cities around the world have set, and some are actually starting to be even more ambitious than that. And what we discovered is that even with the adoption of, if you assume a pretty healthy adoption of electric vehicles replacing internal combustion engines over that time period, we still need to reduce the amount of driving that we're doing quite a bit, because our energy grid isn't entirely renewable. It's not even close yet. So what we wanted to do is make the case that it's possible to do that. And that the way to do that is to, one, I'll make it as easy as possible, as I mentioned before, to build housing close to where we have our robust transit network. But two, continue to redesign our transportation network overall to make it easier to live a lifestyle in which you have very real options for getting around that don't necessarily involve a car. That doesn't mean that everybody all the time is going to be on a bike or on a bus or on a train, but if we make it easier to do that, people will do it. And it's happening. If you look at the numbers in our city, even as our city grows in terms of population and jobs, the number of miles being driven in cars, called vehicle miles traveled, is not going up in our city. And that's because we've invested in the public transit network that you talked about. We've redesigned our streets to make it easier to ride a bike on, even when it's 4 degrees outside like it is today. We plow the bike lanes, and we've continued to invest in the pedestrian infrastructure as well to make sure that people can walk.
So I don't know if you know about this, but right now Charlotte is talking about increasing our sales tax by 1% so that we'll be able to expand our bus system and improve the frequencies in our bus services, expand our rail lines to areas outside of Charlotte. And not just light rail, but commuter rail, streetcar. But perhaps even more importantly, invest in pedestrian walkways, bicycle path, and greenways, trails, and all of that. Now, that is going to impact, obviously, the outcome and how we can achieve the comprehensive plan. Was that a conversation at all, even in Minneapolis, that, listen, our transportation funding is not matching and may even complicate the implementation of this plan? So was there any conversation around a reinvestment in your transportation system to help match some of the goals of this 20-year plan?
Absolutely. There was a lot of conversation about that. And the way that played out is once we were finished with the comprehensive plan, the larger framework that ties together the land use and the transportation conversation, then our friends who do transportation planning in our public works department put together a much more detailed plan focusing specifically on what are those transportation investments and street redesigns that we need to do to achieve what it says in Minneapolis 2040 about transportation. So we now have a very detailed plan called the Transportation Action Plan that lays out that specific vision for what to do, and to your point, makes the case for funding from the state and federal government to help us achieve that.
Okay, great. So let's talk about ADUs. There's a number of questions related to the environment that I will bring up and parking, but let's talk about ADUs first of all. So in our comprehensive plan, we are calling for ADUs. For those who are listening, ADU are accessory dwelling units. It could also be ACU, accessory commercial units. Our plan right now, Charlotte Future 2040, calls for ADUs and potential for duplex and triplexes existing home store. But I want us to focus on the ADUs and the commercial units. Was that a focus of Minneapolis 2040 as well?
It was part of the conversation, but we had actually already made that legal in Minneapolis before we started Minneapolis 2040. Yeah. ADUs have been allowed since I think 2015. And what we found, and they're allowed everywhere, what we found is very similar to what we expected and what we've now seen with the duplexes and triplexes. We found that people are taking advantage of it, but it's also incremental. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's not a huge number of new ADUs, but people are doing it and finding that it's helpful in all of the cases that you can imagine. That sometimes they're called mother-in-law apartments, and that's sometimes literally how people use them, is for extended family, but it can also provide some income to help with your own housing costs and provide an affordable place for a neighbor to live above a garage or in a separate structure in the backyard. And what we found is that there are a lot of really creative designs for doing this that are aesthetically pleasing, that don't hinder your enjoyment of your block or your neighborhood. They're a cool thing.
That's good. So let's talk about parking. So what is the role of parking in all of this, especially in residential areas, as you know? How were you able to deal with issues related to environmental justice, tree canopy, climate issues? We're working on our tree canopy action plan as well right now in the middle of our comprehensive plan. But how was Minneapolis 2040 able to address some of these environmental issues related to tree? Minneapolis is one of the most beautiful cities, has a lot of tree coverage as well, just like we do in Charlotte. So how were you able to address this, especially with an increased pace of development? How was the plan able to address that? And issues related to climate change?
Right. Well, something that helps greatly is we're able to, as I mentioned before, we're able to tell the truth, which is that our experience is that as we grow, the number of vehicle miles traveled is not increasing, which is very important because those emissions from vehicles are a very substantial portion of the overall greenhouse gas emissions that we're seeing. But there's important, I think you alluded to this in your question, there are really important issues of environmental justice. So it's most cities have industrial areas that may have some polluting industries in them. We have those as well in Minneapolis. And what you'll see, you'll often see a pattern where your lowest income communities are often next to those industrial areas with pollution. So one specific strategy that we have been able to employ with this comprehensive plan to help with that situation is to be very clear that going forward, we are going to change the regulations, change the zoning in those areas to no longer allow any polluting industries. And just as importantly, make sure that we are prioritizing businesses to locate in those areas that provide living wage jobs for the folks who live nearby.
That's really good. So in other words, drive less, travel less, or you still be able to access the things that you want to do because the options are available.
Right.
All right. We cannot talk about a plan like this without bringing up the G word or the D word, gentrification, displacement. So talk to us about specific land use strategies that were employed in the plan. We've got a few in our comprehensive plan, but I'd like our audience to learn from your experience, and maybe there are things that we can do with our plan that can even minimize the impact of gentrification or of development on people in terms of gentrifying neighborhoods and ultimately displacing them. And it's not just about people, right? It's also about businesses.
Right.
So talk to us a little bit about what specific land use strategies, one or two or three that were employed.
So I mentioned this before, but I want to reiterate it. I think the most important strategy is to make sure that in our land use plan, we are allowing the market to go to the places where it wants to go, so that it doesn't spill over into the places where it's less welcome and where it can cause displacement. So that is job one, in my professional opinion, is to make sure that you're not constraining the market in the places where it wants to go, because it's going to go somewhere.
Yes.
As your population increases, people need places to live, and people with means will use those means to find a place to live. So you don't want to constrain the market. But second, you also, that's not going to be enough. You've got to have some proactive strategies as well. So something that we were able to employ in Minneapolis is something called inclusionary zoning. So now anytime a developer is building a larger apartment building above a certain number of units, they are required to set aside some of those units as affordable housing. And there are very specific rules as to how that works. But the idea there is, as we grow, and we will continue to grow, we want to make sure that the housing units that are being produced aren't just for the highest income residents. We want to make sure that some of those are set aside for lower income folks as well. And that's in addition to a whole bunch of other proactive strategies, but that's one that I wanted to highlight.
Oh, that's really important. Something to definitely bring up there. So how did the plan also address dealing with impervious surfaces, heat island effect, green infrastructure, especially when it comes to stormwater management? I'm assuming that was mostly in the regulations, but were there policies that you developed as part of the plan to address those?
Right, exactly. If, as I've mentioned, and as you know, if you're going to put in regulations, you have to have some policies to support them and help people connect the dots as to why this is important. So yes, the plan very specifically addresses all of those issues you just mentioned, that as we redevelop the city, it's actually an opportunity in a lot of cases to decrease impervious surface. In other words, if you're seeing a new building being built on what was previously a parking lot, that parking lot was 100% impervious. All of the stormwater was running off. It was contributing to the heat island effect because it's hot asphalt in the summer. And when you're replacing that parking lot with a building that has landscaping and green stormwater features that treat the stormwater on site, that's a net positive for the environment. So yes, the plan makes that connection for folks, and then we are again following up with regulations to support that to make sure that we're making good on it. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit, and I know it's 12:30 and you've been talking for quite a while, so let's pivot a little back to transit. Minneapolis has the North Star, right? That's your commuter rail system.
That's a commuter rail system that comes in from the exurbs, essentially.
St. Cloud, I think St. Cloud, if I recall. Right. Yeah. Okay. So one of the corridors that we're looking at is to the north of Charlotte. If we were able to get funding and approval from the General Assembly to increase our sales tax, one of the first out of the gate that we're really hoping for is our red line commuter rail. Now, we know the land use along commuter rail, light rail, and even streetcar will be different. Was there anything in the Minneapolis 2040 plan that addresses these land uses along commuter? Because commuter rail is not frequently used, right? It only comes maybe in the morning and in the evening, and probably, and then light rail is more frequent. Did the plan address some of those issues, and what type of development could occur along different modes of transportation?
Right. So the way the plan deals with development near transportation is that in the places that have the highest frequency, highest amenity transit, like light rail, those are the places where the most intense, the densest development is allowed.
Mhm.
So if you look at where those light rail stations are throughout the city, even outside the center of the city, you'll see that we're allowing 15, 20, sometimes 30-story buildings to be built in those places. And then it kind of goes down from there. If you have a frequent bus line, maybe it's 4 or 6 stories. A less frequent bus line, maybe it's 3 stories, and so on. On the commuter rail question specifically, Ty, we actually only have one commuter rail station in the city proper, and that's downtown. So it's not an issue that we really
because it's already there.
It's already there, and yeah, the most intense development is allowed. Now, our friends in the suburban communities who have North Star commuter rail stations, of course, have been doing that work, and they've been doing transit-oriented development at those stations, even though it is not, as you pointed out, the most frequent transit service. It's still important to their communities and an opportunity to build housing and retail and other important transit supportive land uses near those stations.
Okay, great. So I have a couple other questions that I will ask you. Let's talk about Airbnb. How are you dealing with that? And I don't think it necessarily has to do with the plan as much as generally as a city. How are you dealing with that, with the use of Airbnbs? I know you're likely going to deal with them in your regulations, but on a short-term and a long-term basis, how are you handling those issues? Because we do have some concerns in Charlotte around that.
Right, we are in the middle of that. I think, like most cities are, and trying some things. We started with simply acknowledging them in regulation and having a licensing process to make sure that we could manage them and enforce the rules on them. Now there are some efforts underway to limit the number of short-term rental units that can be in any given building to try to prevent the scenario where developer builds 100 units and they're all used that way. So it's essentially a hotel, rather than an apartment building that's actually contributing to the housing needs of the community. So yeah, it's a challenge and a balancing act.
Okay. And then I know you've got a lot of historic areas in Minneapolis as well. So how did you, in the plan, how did you address minimizing impact on historic areas, addressing historic preservation policies?
The way we dealt with that was to not change what we already had. So we already have a system of historic districts and individual historic landmarks. All of that remains in place in the context of this larger plan, and that was something that people, of course, were concerned about, and we wanted to make sure we stayed committed to those preservation activities.
That's really good, because that's something that we have to definitely be mindful of in these conversations around our comprehensive plan and ultimately our Unified Development Ordinance. And I think that we're dealing with it. We actually just had our own first historic district in the first one in the last 10 years, Oakland, which was a really major big deal for us. And we think that there will probably be more communities that will be asking for that type of designation in the future. So something we definitely are mindful of. And I agree with you. If it's working, leave it alone. If it needs to get better, then let's find a way to get it better. What it is that Maya Angelou said, if you find something isn't working, find something that works better. And once you know it works better, then do better. Isn't it? So always do better. All right. This is a specific question with regards to rezoning. So, and I know you don't have as many rezoning petitions as we have as a city, and your process is probably different from ours. But when you increase the number of units from maybe going from 6 to 10, 10 to 15, what's the process for doing that? I mean, you just kind of say, I know this allows 6 units, but because we want to allow affordable housing and other things, how do we go from 6 to 10 or 6 to 15 without having to overwhelmingly change the character of that community? What goes into that process for you?
So you mean the actual review process to get to an approval? Yeah. Yes. Okay. So, well, it starts with a developer and their architect sits down with the professional planning staff to go over the plans for the building. And what our staff spend a lot of time on is working to make those plans better, to make sure that they are complying with the policies of the comprehensive plan and with the very specific regulations of the ordinance. As you mentioned, rezoning is not a thing that we have to do quite as often in Minneapolis, but there still is a robust process. And we tie that process to an application for site plan review. Okay. So the site plan review ordinance and process is all about the layout of the site. How is the building positioned relative to other buildings and to the street? What are the landscaping requirements? Those elements of impervious surface that I talked about before come into play, and then some building design elements. Making sure that we don't have blank walls that people are walking next to, and that there are windows going into the building, and all of those important things that make walking in an urban experience something that's pleasant and safe. So that's really where the process in Minneapolis is focused, is on those elements. And then there is a formal public hearing at the Planning Commission where that application is considered, and anybody has the opportunity to testify in favor or against it.
Okay. So someone posted here and said, in an American Bar Association presentation last fall, a prominent developer in Minneapolis indicated that he would no longer build affordable housing in the city, even if the cost was subsidized. I don't know if you know anything about that, but this is something you can.
I think I know which developer that was, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you shed some light on that?
I think that probably what that was, Ty, was in the context of developing this inclusionary zoning policy that I mentioned before. Yeah, what we've seen so far, well, no, we only have 1 year of data so far to judge it on, but we have not, even in the midst of this pandemic and economic slowdown and the new introduction of that inclusionary zoning ordinance, we have not seen a slowdown in multifamily development. It has continued.
That's really good. That's very encouraging. Someone is asking if we could see the chart that showed the housing boom in various cities again. And if you could share with us briefly, what are those key drivers for the growth of these cities? And I guess I could, while you're pulling that up, I could actually answer that to a degree in terms of, because we have 2 cities that are growing. Throw in there Austin, Phoenix, Nashville. And what are those drivers when it comes to cities growing, getting more jobs? I think a lot of it has to do with quality of life, affordable housing, mobility. People are going to go where they can find jobs. They're going to go where housing is affordable. They're also going to go where they can move around and about with minimal disruption and congestion. But there are some other things that go into driving people, especially we're seeing that in this pandemic environment, that are driving people to go into certain cities, and that people are not necessarily afraid of density, they are worried about overcrowding. And so if they feel that, you're building in such a way that it's smart, it connects them to public transit, it's still affordable, and they can stay connected to their neighbors, and they can stay in place or age in place. Those types of things do attract people to cities. But in the case of Minneapolis, maybe you can share something with us, especially with regards to this slide. What are those key drivers for those cities that you see that really made it important for people to want to live where they are, to go into those places, maybe the first few cities there?
Yeah, in Minneapolis, it's driven a lot by we have more Fortune 500 companies based in Minneapolis than we really should proportionally, given our population. So that creates a magnet for people from around the country looking for living wage employment, people with the skills to do those jobs. So that drives a lot of our population growth. Another very important factor that's driving growth here is international immigration from around the world, and that is been something that has really made made this a great place to live. Our population is diversifying, and it's really exciting. And the other factor, and you alluded to this, is I think just those basic quality of life factors. In my opinion, this is a beautiful city to live in, and does have a lot of amenities that make it a great place to live, including winter. We actually like winter here. So and all of these cities on this chart where you see that gap between the population growth and the housing growth, they all have their own version of that story. I think they all have that combination of a strong overall economy and those quality of life factors that make them a nice place to live.
Okay, so talking about housing, so now that we know our plan is talking about, expanding areas where we have single family residential zoning right now to allow more housing products, just like you've done in Minneapolis. But how do you prevent, and I know you talked a little bit about it earlier in terms of market factor. People want to hear also is, how do you prevent oversaturation of apartments and this particular housing products in one part of the city over another, even though the entire city is rezoned and mapped to allow it? How do you avoid that?
I think a lot of that tie is just in how you craft the map itself. And so I talk a lot about making it easier to build multifamily housing, but it's not everywhere. It's very strategic in terms of where we show that on the map and where it's allowed. I think if you did allow it everywhere, you could see some downsides and some repercussions that wouldn't be good. So it's really as the planners for our city, we know our city, and the community knows the city. So we were able to work together to identify those places where it made the most sense to show that on the map. And the other thing that's really important is to really pay attention over time. Don't just do the plan and then move on. We're going to keep tracking what's happening and reassess. So, when we update the plan in the future, we will know what the result of this latest effort was, and we can adjust as necessary. So if it doesn't work well in a particular part of the city, we can change it.
Okay. Great. I don't know if everyone on this call knows that Charlotte was given the approval, I would say, to host the New Urbanism Congress, the new Congress of New Urbanists in 2022, I think. But you were supposed to have yours last year, right? And then COVID hit. Right. So what's the status? Are you going to have it this year virtually, or is it going to be pushed into 2022? Because I know we're going to be pushed out. So.
No, as far as I know, it will not. That was our chance in this cycle to host it in person. That was very, of course, disappointing. That it wasn't able to happen. We were excited to show people around our beautiful cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul and talk about all these new urbanist principles, but it had to be virtual.
Okay. Well, I know there's just a lot of questions that I can keep asking you over and over, but I will come to you right now and say, Paul, what can you share with us as we journey? We are in this journey. We're in this phase of our journey that you've been in. We're engaging our community. There's still a lot of questions that people have in their minds.
Yeah.
There's a lot of policies in the plan, obviously, a lot of goals. We've got about 10 goals. We've got about 14. But people have questions. So what I want you to, if you could, just talk to us a little bit here in terms of how important is predictability in the process, especially predictability and transparency. Transparency to the community, predictability to the development industry. I'd like you to share your experience with us and give us some advice on how we deal with that going forward from here.
Right. Thanks for that question. This goes back to my imperfect parenting analogy at the beginning of my talk, which is, um, if my kids are asking me 36 questions an hour about what, can I do this? Can I do that? And eh, my wife and I we set goals and we put rules into place for how to answer those questions and what expectations our kids should have for their day, because we as parents have some authority over how our kids spend their time. And so by putting that framework in there for expectations, their day is more predictable, and they can thrive, and we can thrive as a family, because we have that predictability and we know what to expect, and we're not constantly, at least in the ideal world, arguing with each other about all these little decisions. And that's the analogy with the city, is that if you can come to some shared values and a shared vision and process and framework for how you're going to grow and change over time, then the hope is that you don't have to have arguments about all of those decisions along the way, and that you can understand the trade-offs that are associated with each of those decisions. So I think predictability is really, really important, so that if you see a hole being dug down the street from where you live, you can have some faith and some trust that the building that's going to be built there is conforming to the shared vision that you have as a city, and that it's going to contribute in some way to the larger goals that you all share as a community. So predictability is really, really important.
Yeah, and so is transparency in the process, right? And that's why we want to engage people in this process so they see what's going on. We want to avoid, I want to use the word minimize, but I think that may not be sufficient. But it's really avoiding backroom deals,
Yes.
and surprises to residents of our city, and all of a sudden they wake up and something is different. But getting them involved in the process, being transparent about what that process looks like, it empowers residents and it allows them to know that you really are serious about your policies. How did you deal with restorative justice as part of the plan? That's one big idea that we have in terms of Charlotte should talk about directing investments into vulnerable communities in the future. But I'd like to know, how did you deal with restorative justice?
We pointed that out just as explicitly as you did. In addition to this regulatory change that we're talking about, the changing the rules, it's really important that we're also being proactive and prioritizing our financial investments to the parts of the city that are most vulnerable and that need that investment the most, and being really clear and transparent, to use your word, that's a good word, about that means that there may be some investments that don't happen in other parts of the city. This is, prioritization is really important if we're going to achieve that goal.
That's great. Well, thank you. There's still, I think I'm leaving about 20 some comments and questions on the table, but we were able to answer over 30 questions, and in addition to some that I just threw at you. So we really thank you. For everyone. We're going to definitely, this is being recorded, and we're going to make sure that you can view it on YouTube channel. There are still opportunities for you to participate in the plan development process. And I'm sure this is not the last. We're going to hear from Paul. I'm sure that after the plan is adopted and we're going through our place types mapping, we probably will bring him back again to share with us some of their experiences. So please continue to participate in the process. And don't hesitate to reach out to us. I know those questions that are there, we definitely will make sure that we look at them, and then we will send them to Paul and myself. I think between us, we can handle most of them and then make sure that we share them as part of our FAQ. Once again, Paul, I want to say thank you very much to you. I appreciate the opportunity to interact with you again today and to be able to moderate this session. So Alicia, I'll turn this over to you. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Paul and Taiwo, for a great, robust discussion about the Charlotte Future 2040 plan. As Ty mentioned, there are a number of opportunities in the future to learn more about the plan and just to simply have dialogue around the contents of the plan. If you look in the chat, there are several links to our website. What we're launching today is what we're calling our Ambassador Toolkit. And that's a way for folks that have been involved in the plan to actually connect with their neighbors and share information in great detail about the plan's contents and how they can be involved. So look on our website for that information as well. And also next week, we will be launching a virtual open house, which will be a virtual experience to navigate a virtual meeting room to explore the contents of the actual plan document. It'll be available 24/7, so you have the opportunity to look at the information at your leisure, take a section of a plan one day at a time or 1 week at a time. We're just trying to respond as much as we can to our opportunities, limited opportunities to meet together, but providing information through a virtual experience. So please visit our website for more information, sign up for our email list to know and to get more announcements about upcoming events, but we really need to hear your voice in the process because this is the community's plan. Thank you again for your participation and we look forward to seeing you soon.